A lovely, warm, full day, perfect for a trip to Mount Auburn Cemetery. So let's go. Okay, Griffey. Death is supposed to be the great equalizer. The brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes has a famous line, "In the long run, we're all dead." But even in death, the inequities of life persist. For one thing, if you're a member of the New England elite, you can be buried in this gorgeous cemetery beneath these mighty trees and the feet of many bird watchers. Mount Auburn Cemetery has 7 hills like Rome. One of them is called Harvard Hill. Let's go there. Well, this is Harvard Hill. John Rawls was one of the most influential philosophers, political philosophers of the 20th century. He taught at MIT for a bit, but spent most of his career at Harvard. He joined the Harvard faculty in 1962, and his most famous book is A Theory of Justice, written in 1971. And we're going to read an excerpt from that book. And this is Rawls's grave. John Bawdley Rawls, 1921 to 2002. Rawls is famous for his thought experiment of the original position, where he tries to derive the principles that govern a just society by imagining that we're behind a veil of ignorance, deciding what sort of society we want to be in. In what Rawls calls the original position, where we're supposed to decide the principles of justice, no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. So the idea is that if you didn't know what your place in society was going to be, then the principles you choose to govern society would be the principles that govern a just or fair society. And Rawls thought that the principles rational people would choose in that position would make room for inequality of resources, but arrange any inequalities so they were to the benefit of the least advantaged. A very different approach to political philosophy was taken by Rawls's colleague, Robert Nozick, at Harvard, who wrote Anarchy, State and Utopia in 1974. We'll also be reading an excerpt from that. The preface to that book begins, "Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights." And from that starting point, Nozick reached a conclusion very different from Rawls about the nature of a just society. Our main conclusions about the state, he says, are that a minimal state, limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts and so on, is justified, that any more extensive state, for instance a state interested in redistributing wealth to make resources more equally distributed among the population, will violate persons' rights not to be forced to do certain things, and is unjustified, and that the minimal state is inspiring as well as right. And in fact, on Harvard Hill, if you come this way, pretty close to Rawls's grave, is Nozick's, if only I can find it. Oh, here we are. In fact, they died in the same year. Robert Nozick, November the 16th, 1938 to January the 23rd, 2002. Philosopher. Here they both are, overlooking the Boston skyline. Well, you can see Boston when the leaves are off the trees. However you slice it, wealth is very unequally distributed, both within countries and between countries. Oh. Hi, Lola. Come here, baby. Come here. Cat interruption. This is a chart of the share of national income held by the top 10%. So in Europe, which is the lowest, 37% of the national income is held by the top 10%. And at the other end of the scale in the Middle East, the 10% hold a whopping, the top 10% hold a whopping 61% of national income. Here is some data for the US. Top 1% versus bottom 50% national income shares, 1980 to 2016. You can see that in 1980, 11% of national income was received by the top 1% in the US, and by 2016 that had risen to 20%, with a corresponding decline in share of national income for the bottom 50%. The European version of this graph, by the way, is basically flat. The Gini index, or Gini coefficient, is often used as a measure of inequality for a given population. So here we've got a graph with two axes. On the x-axis is the wealth percentile. So the bottom 10% are over to the left, and the top 90% are over to the right. And on the y-axis we have share of wealth in percent. So looking at that curve that divides the grey region and the blue region, imagine that's what we get if we plot for a certain population wealth percentile against share of wealth. We can see that roughly the bottom 30% have about 10% of the wealth. If there is no inequality whatsoever, then the bottom X% have X% of the wealth for any old X. In other words, we get that line at 45 degrees. That would be a sign of perfect equality. And as you can see, the curve that's actually plotted is a more typical curve where we have less than perfect equality, and it's called the Lorentz curve. And the Gini index is just the ratio of the A area to the total area A plus B. So in the case of perfect equality, where A equals 0, the Gini index equals 0. And you can easily see that in the case of perfect inequality, where basically one person has all the wealth, B will be 0, and so the Gini index will be 1. So the closer to 1 we get on the Gini index, the less equality there is. Here's the Gini index represented as a world map. You can see that South Africa has the highest Gini index, 60 to 70, represented as a percent. And the question for this week is all this inequality unjust? From the point of view of justice, is there something wrong with it? Of course, maybe in practice, a country with a high level of inequality is perhaps politically unstable, or maybe people at the very bottom become extremely envious and start causing all sorts of trouble and breaking the law and whatnot. That could very well be an argument for reducing the level of inequality. But suppose that inequality itself doesn't have any of those bad effects. Would there still be something wrong with it? Would it be fundamentally unfair if 1% of the population had 90% of the wealth? The reading for today was, of course, from Rawls' famous book, A Theory of Justice. And Robert Nozick, whom we'll be reading for Wednesday, said in Anarchy, State and Utopia that political philosophers now must either work within Rawls' theory or explain why not, which is an indication of the impact Rawls' book had around the time it was published, and indeed continues to have. Rawls has two principles of justice. These quotes are actually from a later book, Justice as Fairness, but they're pretty close to the formulations in A Theory of Justice. The first principle is that each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. And the second principle is that social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. So Rawls is not against social and economic inequalities, provided that they meet these two conditions. First, they are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. And second, they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society, which Rawls calls the difference principle. Of course, Rawls's theory is one of many alternatives. Here's one that Rawls discusses at some length: utilitarianism. We've already met that as a theory of morality. Society should be organized to maximize happiness, or the more general version is consequentialism. Society should be organized to maximize the good, whatever you think the good is. And depending on the empirical facts about happiness or the good, this could lead to massive inequality, or alternatively, massive equality. That is, utilitarianism and Rawls's theory are rivals. They are not compatible. Let's have a closer look at Rawls's two principles before getting on to how he argues for them. So the first principle is that each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. What are these basic liberties? They are political liberty, the right to vote and hold public office, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, and freedom of the person, property rights, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and also freedom from psychological oppression and physical assault. Well, that's the first principle. Here is the second, which comes in two parts. So the second principle is social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First of all, fair equality of opportunity, and second, the difference principle. The inequalities have to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So here's rules on the first bit, fair equality of opportunity. Assuming that there is a distribution of natural assets, those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success, regardless of their initial place in the social system. Okay, what about the second part of the second principle, the difference principle? And this is the one that bears most strongly on the issue of the week, whether inequality itself is unjust. So this is rules on the difference principle. The higher expectations of those better situated are just if and only if they work as part of a scheme which improves the expectations of the least advantaged members of society. The intuitive idea is that the social order is not to establish and secure the more attractive prospects of those better off, unless doing so is to the advantage of those less fortunate. So maybe that's a bit abstract. Let me illustrate the difference principle with a particular example. So here we've got society divided into four classes of people: the alphas, the betas, the gammas, and the deltas. And there are two possible arrangements, let's say, A and B. And this graph shows the distribution of lifetime wealth among these four classes according to arrangement A and according to arrangement B. So you can see that there's much more wealth under A than there is under B. Further, you can see that everyone is at least as well off under A than under B, apart from the deltas. The deltas are slightly worse off. Never mind about the relative numbers of people in these classes. We can just divide them up equally. Now, from the point of view of the difference principle, which arrangement is more just? Is it arrangement A or arrangement B? Please press K and answer that question. Got it? Well, the answer is that B is better than A. B is better than A because it maximizes the income of the least advantaged. If we imagine moving from arrangement B to arrangement A, then even though the alphas, betas, and gammas will be at least as well off after the move, the gammas will have dropped, which means that the A arrangement is not to the advantage of the least well off compared to B. So B is greater than A as far as justice goes, which you might think is, depending on just how well the deltas are doing, a not obviously correct result. Rawls's main argument for his two principles is that they would be chosen in the original position, a hypothetical situation in which you don't know your social class, race, gender, religion, moral convictions, talents, or goals in life. You do know that you're a person who has a conception of the good without knowing what that conception is, an interest in being able to choose and revise that conception, and an interest in forming and acting on a sense of justice. So you have to choose some principles. Those principles are going to govern the society that you're going to wake up in. And you have to live with those principles. No second chances. There's no going back. What principles would you choose? Here is a neat illustration of the original position that I found on Wikipedia. Here are you, ignorant of your talents, social class, gender, and so on. You don't know whether you have a red head, whether you're big or small, wear glasses or not, or a whiz at math. And here is the veil of ignorance. Looks more like a border wall than a veil of ignorance, but anyway. And here's how society could turn out, depending on what principles you choose. Here's a quote not from the rules reading, excuse me, but from the notes and questions, which gives you a flavour of rules, reasons for thinking that you would choose his two principles. Because of the veil of ignorance, you want to be sure that the society is acceptable from the point of view of each person, because you may be that person. You might turn out to be the guy with the red head, or the guy with the cane. In particular, you want to be sure that it will be acceptable even if you land in the lowest social position where it is least likely to be acceptable. So you try to make sure that the minimum position is as good as it can be. This is the assurance that the two principles provide. They ensure that social arrangements are acceptable to each member of society. So Rawls thinks that you would or should choose his two principles. Two questions then for you. First, would you choose Rawls's two principles in the original position? And second, in any case, does the original position provide a good test for principles of justice? At least Lola didn't bother me again. Read Frankfurt and Nozick for Wednesday. Harry Frankfurt, you may know of him from his book On Bullshit, which made quite a splash. He once appeared to discuss it on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. I'll see you on Wednesday.